This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. Welcome you here into, yes, we are in the mobile studio as we are out traveling around. In this case today, though, I've invited an old longtime friend, Brian Deere. Brian, welcome to the show, first of all. You're in Santa Fe today, right?
I'm in Santa Fe where it's nice and snowy.
Yeah, well, I'm in lovely Florida, and I'm going to need snorkel gear, given how much rain we're getting. Now, Brian and I have had a connection for quite some time because of a common technology we used, which actually was the impetuses for Brian's most recent book. But before we hop into that, Brian, give our listeners a little bit of background about yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a long time, I guess you'd call it a serial tech entrepreneur. I've done a whole bunch of startup companies, either founding them or co-founding or joining and working for. So I've been involved with the whole web phenomenon since there was a web. And my first startup company I founded in 1987, and that was before even the web existed. And even prior to that, I spent several years working on the PLATO System, and that's where I got my first exposure to Plato. And I knew even in the 80s that it was something really phenomenal, and someone needs to write a book about this. This is historic, what's going on, and no one was. And so I just, for some crazy reason, started doing interviews, and around 1985, and it just kept snowballing into a bigger and bigger project, and finally came out as a book in 2017.
Yeah, that now you and I were laughing before we started the show, today on, how hard book projects really are, but I think you hold the new record for guests on the total length of when you started. But the fact that you actually got it done, and look, it's a phenomenal book. But hey, let's give our listeners a little bit of background, because some of them may not have even heard of Plato and that whole system, which is mind-boggling to me, because Plato had fundamental influence into the technologies that each and every listener has in their pocket, has on their desks. Plato was really that early spark. So give us a little context here about Plato.
Sure. The thing that did it for me, that got me fired up to the point of wanting to write a book, was the fact that we all were hearing everything and witnessing the personal computer revolution that was starting in the 1970s and exploded in the 1980s and changed the world, and we're still living the effects of that. But what I saw with Plato right away that completely blew me away, and that the mainstream America wasn't appreciating yet, because they generally hadn't even seen Plato, was that instead of being a personal computer revolution, Plato was an interpersonal computer revolution. And what I would learn starting to do the research on the history of Plato is that, the interpersonal computer revolution started and was booming before the personal computer revolution even got underway. And that is a really hard concept to grasp. And it's one that Silicon Valley, I think, would prefer that you don't even know about. Because basically it challenges the whole, our whole understanding of the rise of popular computing and computer history. And so here was the PLATO system being developed at the University of Illinois, out in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, surrounded by cornfields, in the middle of nowhere, the epitome of flyover country, and 1,000 miles from San Francisco, and just basically off the radar. in one way, it was the perfect place for the Plato system to sort of germinate and start and then flourish without any influence whatsoever, basically, from what was happening in Silicon Valley in the 60s and 70s. I should also mention that the Plato system was founded in 1960, and its mission all the way back then was to see if a computer could be set up, especially with software, to teach students pretty much any subject imaginable. And so even in 1960, there was this crazy, ambitious idea. You talk about innovation. This is wild, crazy innovation, to think that, and ambition, and probably a lot of arrogance to think that you could make the leap from a living, breathing human teacher to a box running on vacuum tubes back then, with very little memory and software written in microcode, let alone a real programming language, and extremely primitive, but that would teach subjects to students. And yet they built it, and all during the 60s, they perfected it, and the graphics got better. And by the mid 60s at the University of Illinois, you could get full college credit for taking an online course with Plato. And that alone is something that the entire online learning industry, which flourishes now, can't even grasp.
Right.
They think this
is the 60s.
They think this stuff started. Yeah,
we're talking about the 60s here, and everybody thinks that online education and online college, is something that's new here in 2010, 2015, 2017, and it's not the case. It's 50 years behind what Plato was doing. And Plato literally laid the foundation for what many would call now the computer-based training industry, because there was no CBT industry that existed until Plato came around. And then not only that, but the fact is okay, you can say you're going to go launch in a new area, but Plato literally had to invent everything. They had to invent the terminal. They had to invent the central processing, the host platforms. They even got down to designing the display technology to show graphics, because at that time there was no ability to do effective graphics on displays. Talk about vertical integration. This is vertical integration of an innovation from literally from the ground all the way up. We're talking about a heavy lift.
Right. If you look at the typical sort of internet, new startups and new products and services that pop up every few hours today, almost everything is a response to the inadequacies of something that currently exists or used to exist and has now become obsolete. So that's why I argue, for example, Google would never have existed if it wasn't for Larry Page and Sergey Brin reacting to the inadequacies of InfoSeek and AltaVista and Lycos and all the other search engines that were all the rage in the mid 1990s. They felt that they didn't do what needed to be done, and they weren't helping people find the right web pages in the right order in search results and all. So they came up with PageRank and all that stuff. And you look at social networks, for example, Facebook would have never needed to arise yet for the perceived inadequacies of MySpace. Zuckerberg did not like MySpace and thought he could do better. And if you look at MySpace, it's a reaction to Friendster and the earlier social networks. And you see this over and over and over again. But with Plato, it happened so early, there were no predecessors. And all of the innovation that happened pretty much had to start from scratch, which is a remarkable thing. And so that makes the story of how, it came from, very primitive components to a very rich, thriving social environment online a really remarkable story.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable when you think about the things that we just take for granted today. And you look at any innovation, right? There's always some form of inspiration. In the case of Plato, Plato's one of those technology areas where you can say nothing existed. So it wasn't like you could point to some previous inspiration that was kind of the catalyst that showed the path. Plato had to go create the path. So when we come back, we're going to pick up our conversation with Brian Deere, talk more about his book, more about Plato, and what Plato's influence has been in our lives today. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short commercial break. Welcome back to Innovations. We're picking up our conversation with Brian Deere. Brian and I were talking in the first segment really about the background on Plato, but I want to talk more specifically, Brian, about your book, The Friendly Orange Glow. As soon as you talk, as soon as anybody mentions the orange glow, you can tell if somebody's got familiarity with Plato or not. So give us a little context on the title of the book, but also I think your subtitle is also quite interesting, talking about the birth of the cyberculture. So give us some context of the title so that those listeners who are not familiar with Plato kind of get the context.
Fine, sure. I'll give you the story behind the meaning of the friendly orange glow phrase, which is not something I coined. It's actually something that people used as a regular day in, day out expression to describe Plato for years. The subtitle of the book is The Untold Story of the PLATO System and the Dawn of Cyberculture. And so let me first, I'll talk about the friendly orange glow, and then I'll go into the other stuff. Speaking of Plato being starting basically from scratch, and then them realizing that they had to that in order to really teach students effectively on a computer, you need a good graphics display to start with. And in 1960, there were none unless you were the Pentagon and could spend $1 billion, and maybe you would get one. But to have them in front of students in schools and stuff like that, it did not exist. And then they realized that the cost of memory to drive a cathode ray tube, a CRT, television display, which would be the common computer monitor until the late 90s, was so insanely expensive. In 1960, random access memory, or RAM, would have cost $2 per bit, not even byte. So, the typical iPhone today with like 64 gigabytes would be a multi-billion-dollar, computer in 1960 just because of the memory. Mm-hmm. And a Plato terminal, they figured, is going to need about 512 by 512 pixels, and that would be about 262,000 bits. And you can see that, we're talking of like $500,000 just for the memory to drive the display. So that was just not going to happen. So they started looking at other alternatives. What else existed? And was it even possible to come up with a display that did not require RAM? And they actually realized that there was such a thing, and it was called, the idea was called a plasma display, which is basically a very thin sheet of glass with a lot of holes in it, and nearly invisible electrodes running, up and down and left and right. And wherever they cross, if an electrical charge hit that one intersection, it would, in theory, charge a tiny little bit of gas in the glass. And so they worked on this for years. And in 1964, they reached their eureka point where they got one dot lit. And then in the next year, they would get like 4, and then 8, and then 16. And by about 1967, they had, I think, certainly 16. They may have even gotten 64 pixels going. And they discovered that the best looking display was a combination of neon gas, which glows orange, and a little bit of nitrogen and some other little bits of gas. And so basically, the massive breakthrough that this Plato team of engineers and physicists came up with was that you did not need RAM to show the Plato display, because when you were looking at a plasma display, the pixels were the memory. You were literally looking at the memory. It would be like looking at a live computer chip and seeing little things lit up on it, and them forming letters and numbers and graphics and things like that. And that's how the Plato plasma display worked. And by 1971, they had it being manufactured by a commercial company in quantity, and it was ready for production. And it got introduced to the world in 1972. And immediately people started, turning off the lights in their offices and just having this orange glow coming out from the screen. And if you would go into a Plato classroom with like 32 terminals and the lights were off, it totally looked like something right out of an air traffic control center, where everyone's huddled around these glowing screens and everything. And so that's where the phrase came from. Now, the other aspect of this, which I think is probably the most interesting, is the rise of the what I called before the interpersonal computer revolution, and the beginnings of social computing and online community, and pretty much everything we take for granted now. And what people don't realize, and you will not find pretty much in any computer history book, even the big famous ones that have been out in the last 5 years, there's no mention of Plato, and there's no acknowledgement that basically, around 1973, you had a complete thriving online culture with instant messaging, chat rooms, multiplayer games, email, message forums, an online newspaper that was crowdsourced by the user community. And all this was booming in a culture that centered in Illinois, but with users all over the place dialing in. And so this I go into great detail on this part of the book. It's basically 1/3 of the book, trying to figure out how it all happened. And it turns out that it was never planned. It was not part of the mission. It wasn't part of the funding from the National Science Foundation. Basically, the kids who were supposed to be the students learning on Plato figured out that the most interesting thing about Plato was Plato. And they started hacking the system and discovered that the programming language was so good that you could basically build all kinds of interactive social apps on it. And the whole sort of app culture and hacker community arose in 72 and 73, and it changed the lives of thousands of people. And a lot of what we take for granted that would emerge much, much later, in the 90s, like with AOL and all that, was actually happening on Plato in the 70s.
And that's the interesting piece, right? I think it's this emergence, right? You can't plan for it, right? You can launch services, and it's really about letting the user community tell you what it is they're going to use it for. And Plato was fertile. I mean, some of the things that were available on Plato were decades ahead of anything that we see and we think of as social media today. So we'll be right back after this quick commercial break, continuing our conversation on Plato. Welcome back to Co-Innovations. We're continuing our conversation with Brian Deere around Plato and specifically his book. Now, Brian, as we were going into the commercial break, we were talking about, the fact of Plato was unique in the fact that it allowed its users to literally use it as a platform for them to innovate on top of. Kind of, this emergent innovation process. But let's not forget the time frame this was, right? When I was in school, I was getting a certain amount of CPU time. I could only use it for my problems, machine problems for my college classes. I couldn't get access just to experiment and and learn in the process. But the culture within the Plato team was completely different, correct?
Yeah, that's one of the things that really struck me when I started digging into this. I found that since the very beginning of the Plato project in 1960, the sort of the culture that had emerged at the laboratory was one where, unlike a lot of other engineering and technical and physics and scientific labs around the country and universities, this was a place where undergraduates were welcome to work side by side with PhDs and postdocs and all that. And even furthermore, high school kids who would wander in from down the street, having heard about this the friendly orange glow, and this was the home of the glow. You could actually go in, and you'd see rooms full of these terminals. The amazing thing is most technical labs, the late 60s, early 70s, if you were a kid and you wandered in, first of all, the door would probably be locked, but not here. At Plato, you could walk in, you could find a room full of terminals. If there was a spare one available, you could sit down, and instead of being shooed away, or your parents being called, or whatever, one of the senior staff or something might wander by and go like, hey there, what are you doing? And well, here, why don't you try this? And if you find that interesting, why don't you try solving this problem? And if you like programming, well, here's another problem. Solve this, and I'll come back in an hour. And they would encourage people to try things out. And of course, word got out really fast that if you were sort of a geeky personality and were drawn to cool technology, and there really was nothing cooler than a Plato terminal with its orange display, and the fact that the display also was touch sensitive. We haven't talked about that. The fact that Plato terminals were really the first large scale deployment of touch screens, and you could just reach out and touch. And it wouldn't happen until the mid 2000s that, Steve Jobs would finally come around and realize that touch was the future of devices. So the culture that emerged at Plato was one where it was encouraged. They encouraged kids to come in, try things out. If they discovered that you had a sort of an interest and maybe some talent with programming, they give you a project. And if you delivered on that, then they might even start paying you. And so there's an amazing story of one guy named David Frankel, who was hired as a full-time staff person on the system software staff at age 12. And he was too young to be paid by state law, because it would have been child labor. And so they had to give him cookies and milk, and I think they gave him a ski jacket and other kinds of little trinkets and toys and stuff until he was 14. And at that time, he was allowed to start collecting an income. So, and he's gone off and had a brilliant career in technology. He's now in Silicon Valley and has been running a company and that kind of thing. And there's story after story of high school kids coming in, being encouraged rather than discouraged or chased away. And they would start building games or social apps or other simulations, all kinds of advanced stuff. And then go off and have a career in Silicon Valley or whatever. There are Plato people still all over the place. They're in Google, they're in Microsoft, they're probably in Facebook. This was a real thing, and it really changed a lot of lives. And they all went out and spread out into the computer industry.
Well, and I'm one of those examples, right? So
yeah,
I was a recipient of a National Science Foundation grant in high school. So I did my senior year in high school and my freshman year in college at the same time. And I was living in Chicago. So I was going to the University of Illinois at Chicago, which had Plato terminals. So as a high school senior in the 70s, my experience and what got me into programming was my experience on Plato. And, and in fact, you and I, connected uh, at a conference you actually organized at Computer History Museum to highlight kind of the history of the Plato terminal. And yes, you can go to the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley. You can actually see the Plato terminal there. But the reach of Plato and the influence of Plato is, I always run into somebody, right? That some kind of connection, and then you find out that they got their start on Plato as a high school kid or starting off early in college.
Well, one thing that has been very well documented and people are fairly familiar with is the history of the internet and how it got started as something called the ARPANET. But what people don't realize is that the size of the Plato network compared to ARPANET was Plato was much bigger in terms of its user community. And ARPANET would not exceed Plato until about 1982 or 83. So for the entire span of the 1970s, Plato was bigger. It had more users and they were doing more things. The ARPANET was, you could probably argue, was bigger in the sense of the physical network of different systems interconnected. But if you look at how many people were actually on each system, it wasn't a lot. They typically were, a handful of researchers or whatever. But there wasn't access to, you couldn't be a kid coming in off the street and sit down and play with the ARPANET. It was hard. And there wasn't much to do, and it didn't have the graphics or any of the kind of, or the touch, or the games, or the social features. It had some of them, but nowhere near the kind of incredibly rich culture that an online set of apps that Plato had.
Well, I think it's also Plato, as we were talking when you started the segment around this emergent innovation, is everybody's own little project that you were working on, and you would show it to the person sitting next to you. They would have feedback saying, "Hey, how about adding this or changing that?" So you got into the whole emergence of crowdsourcing, and when students started a project and then they left, to start their careers, they would hand those projects off to somebody else who would then take those projects and even take them even further. So this whole issue of crowdsourcing and the community that came around it was incredibly impactful on people, of inspiring each other and bouncing ideas off of each other.
Right. I have a chapter called The Red Sweater in the book, and it's about this guy named Bruce Perello, who he was just an undergrad student, and in 1973 he started using Plato, and he had some interesting personality traits. He would only wear a red sweater every single day of his life, and so he wore the same clothes every day, whether it was the deepest of winter with blizzard conditions or the hottest day in the summer. He still wore the red sweater. But he created an online app called News Report, which was basically, as far as I can tell, the world's first online newspaper. And you were talking about, students being able to take over the system when you graduated. That was actually a case where, unfortunately, when he graduated, there were no other maintainers. And so the whole News Report phenomenon, which had been remarkable, kind of just died off within months. And but what they did on that system is absolutely amazing. And that was a fun chapter to write.
Yeah, and I think it's indicative of just that whole community of picking things up, supporting it, and actually encouraging each other to try new things. So we're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to wrap up our conversation on Plato. Welcome back to Q Innovations. We're going to wrap up our conversation today here with Brian Deere, talking about the Plato project. And more specifically, Brian, I want to talk about your project of picking up the task of documenting the history of Plato. You were the one that kind of took this on starting in the 80s And now your book is out. It's published. It's a great book, by the way. Listeners, you want to go check out this book if you really want to understand the influence that these technologies had on our world today. But Brian, give me a little bit of insight into, in effect, you are, the archivist of the history of Plato now. What was involved in that? Because you started this a long time ago. This has been a passion project for yours for quite some time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I must say, I was always the reluctant archivist and the reluctant historian. I didn't want to do this. I just got tired of waiting for someone else to do it. All I wanted to do was curl up in a chair and read a big, heavy book that was the whole history of the Plato system, because I was always fascinated in it. And I waited and waited and waited, and it didn't seem to be happening. And so I started poking around and doing interviews in the 1980s. There were three books that influenced me. The Right Stuff, which is the history of the Mercury astronauts and the beginning of the NASA space program. It's an amazing book.
Yep.
It's just a wild ride. It's way better than the movie, which is also good. And The Soul of the New Machine, which is another classic book.
That is an unbelievable book. That book really was my inspiration to go to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and the other one was Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution by Steve Levy.
Yep.
So those three books fell into my lap in the early 1980s, and right in the peak of my activity with Plato. And I kept thinking, like, none of these books, the Hackers, there's no mention of Plato. And then I noticed more and more books would come out and about the history of computing, because it's a great subject, and no mention of Plato. And it just kept driving me crazy. And so I just started interviewing people starting around 1985. I went out to the University of Illinois and hung out at the Plato lab in 86 for a couple of days, interviewed everybody that was willing to talk, and pretty much everybody was. And that, you talk to one person, you realize they'll tell you, well, you got to talk to these 5 or 10 other people. And that would just explode and explode. And over the many years, I wound up interviewing probably close to 1,000 people. And I wound up, I recorded everything, and I would have to type up the transcripts of all that stuff. And that took years, and resulted in about 7 million words of transcripts, and the book is 210,000 words long, which is a big book. If I had my way with the publisher, it would have been about 3 volumes and about 2,000 pages long, but they said no. But yeah, there was a lot of research. I actually wrote a one-page query letter to the publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, in 1987, and I got a very nice, brief letter back a week later saying, we are interested. Please send the manuscript at your convenience. And 28 years later, the person who had sent that letter was still the managing editor at Knopf. And so I sent her the manuscript in late 2014. And she was rather amused, probably was a record in terms of the longest delay, but a new definition of the phrase "at your convenience." But it wound up working, and I signed with Pantheon, one of the imprints of Knopf, and it's been just a thrill. It was, in my view, it's the best publisher in the world, and they understood right away that there's something very special about Plato, that it's never been covered before in any book ever. And in fact, that for them, that made it actually even more special, because that meant there was no competition. And I should add, having done many tech startups over the years and gone to venture capital pitches by the thousands, and the one thing they tell you to never tell a venture capitalist is that you have no competition, that you came up with this idea and there's no one else. And the funny thing is, with this book project, I could guarantee that I had no competition, for all those years because no one else was crazy enough to take on this project. But in the end, it really helped because the book is unique. It's the first, and I hope of many books. I mean, if you think about it, there are bookshelves full of Steve Jobs books and history of Google and Microsoft and Xerox PARC and all that. This is the first Plato book ever, and I hope we'll see more articles and more research because it's a very interesting field that was hugely influential and just unfortunately got neglected and almost lost to history. So yeah, it's been a really interesting ride.
Well, and Brian, I think your book, though, I think you're right, though. I think it's going to open up people's eyes to the influence that something that happened out in areas that we hadn't even thought about, and the influence that it has, that's had on our lives today, whether it be graphic display technologies or computer-based learning or this whole emergence of the cyberculture, as you call it. So, how's the book doing? I mean, it's been out now for a little while, and seems to be getting some good reviews.
Yeah. I been getting some really good reviews. Wall Street Journal did a rave review about it, and the funny thing is, the reviewer sent me an email begging to call and chat, and we wound up talking on a weekend for like 90 minutes. He was so excited, and so yeah, I'm doing an event in March at South by Southwest. I'll do a book reading and talk and a signing, and I've got other talks going on for the rest of the year. So I'm still on the road doing it.
Great. So where can people find you? Really quick, we're coming down to the last few seconds of the show here.
Well, anything about the book and contact information for me, go to friendlyorangeglow.com.
Good.
And on the contact page, you can get my Twitter account and my email address and all that stuff. And you can also see where I am at on a book tour. So
and here we go. We're going to wrap it up. Brian, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to join us. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.